Hola clase, ¿cómo están? This is Professor Wagner. Welcome to this first video for Exam 1, Capítulo 11. In this video, I will be talking about the grammatical points that were covered in Chapter 11 of the textbook. I will be going over each of them point by point and with grammar explanations and examples. And hopefully it will help you understand these concepts in a way that was different from what was explained in the textbook. If you think that you need more clarification on anything, please send me an email or post on the discussion board that is called Open Forum. Make sure that you participate in that because it will be very useful for yourself and for everybody else. So let me share my screen here. El examen 1 evaluará tu conocimiento en la habilidad auditiva. So there will be 2 listening portions. La lectura, there will be reading comprehension as well. Vocabulario capítulo 11. So in this chapter, we have been looking at el cuerpo humano y la salud, el consultorio médico. We have been learning terminology for going to the doctor, las enfermedades and other things. It's your responsibility to know these terms, this vocabulary on your own. So make sure that you are very familiar with it. La cultura, there will be a question on this, Venezuela for this chapter. So also takes some time and read that part in the chapter as well. Gramática, esto es lo que vamos a estudiar en este video hoy. Pretérito y el imperfecto. Los pronombres relativos, que, quién, quiénes, lo que. Las acciones recíprocas, reciprocal constructions. La escritura. So this is not gramática, right? But this is just something that's going to also be in the exam, which my point here was hay un alto énfasis en el aspecto de la escritura. So there's an emphasis on writing for this exam. En este repaso, for this review, vamos a ver el pretérito, el imperfecto, los pronombres relativos y las acciones recíprocas. Let's start with the preterite, el pretérito. So I have a little acronym here that will help you remember. Always remember the preterite, el pretérito, as completed actions. This is different from the imperfect. Completed actions as something that has concluded, that is not ongoing. It can also be the beginning or end of an action and or a series of actions. Por ejemplo, ayer mis abuelos vinieron a visitarnos. Vinieron a visitarnos, so my grandparents came yesterday to visit us, is a one-time event that concluded. So again, it's used for past completed actions, the series, and to narrate these past events, right? We have another example here. Normalmente, normally, or usually, cenan a las 6, pero anoche cenaron a las 8. So notice that there are some times here. It's kind of giving you some markers that this happened in this finite amount of time, right? They ate dinner or they had supper at 8 o'clock. This is an event that happened. It concluded. So again, we would use the preterite, el pretérito. Usos del pretérito, acciones completas. Tenemos unos ejemplos, some examples here. Ayer, la profesora enseñó la clase de ciencias naturales. So you can think of this as the professor yesterday taught the class. The class is an event that ended. So therefore, the preterite. Principio y fin de las acciones. With this example, we actually have a series of actions that specify the beginning and the end of it, right? El sábado pasado empecé la tarea y la terminé hasta el domingo. So the first time here is last Saturday, I started and then it ended on Sunday, or I finished doing the homework, in other words. Acciones en serie. El lunes fui a la escuela, hablé con el director, enseñé 5 clases, almorcé con mis colegas y después fui a casa. So if you think of the preterite, you can think of it as in the way a story progresses or happens, right? First, A happens, then B happens, then C happens. For B to happen, A has to have concluded, for C to happen, B has to have concluded, and so on and so forth. And so in all of these situations, it's the preterite because, again, it's a series of actions, right? So we have el lunes fui, I went to school. Concluded action, hablé, I spoke to the director. Enseñé 5 clases, I taught 5 classes. Almorcé, I ate lunch. Y después fui a casa. And of course, all of these events are actions that happened, ended, and so on. Preterite. El imperfecto is different and in many ways the opposite of the preterite. Now, in English, we don't really use the concept of the preterite or the imperfect in the same way that we do in Spanish. There isn't the same differentiation, and it's very grammatically different. So I'm not going to go into the explanation for it because I don't want to confuse you. All I want to say is the imperfect in English kind of covers the same uses of the preterite and the imperfect in Spanish, and we're going to see how. But for now, el imperfecto is for repeated habitual actions in the past. And so this is important because versus the preterite where it's a one-time event, something that happened once, this is repeated, something that is like a habit, etc. Also past ongoing actions, so something that used to happen or would happen, also to describe how things were like in the past. And so you can think of this as descriptions, right? So basically like something that used to happen in the 18th century, or maybe it's a description of how a day was. Any of those are for the imperfect. We also see time and people's ages in the past. Well, why is that? Because ages or people's age is something that's a very broad period of time. It's not very specific. It's something that goes on, it's ongoing. So then you can think of it as it's not specific in regards to time. It's more vague. So therefore it's the imperfect, even though it's in the past. Cuando tenía 10 años, iba a la escuela todos los días. So this is referring to something that used to happen in the past. Age is very specific for this because we can identify the past with a time when we were a certain age, when I was 10, when I was 12, when I was 1, etc. So speaking of the English equivalents del imperfecto, it's things that would happen. So I have this, yo hablaba. These are all the equivalences for English to the imperfect in Spanish, yo hablaba. I spoke, I was speaking, I used to speak, I would speak. Now, if you notice, this first one right here is what we call the preterite in Spanish, right? I spoke. While these are more kind of ongoing. I was speaking, I used to speak, I would speak. And yet all of these represent the imperfect in English. So that's why it can be confusing. But if you follow these guidelines that we're going to go over several times in this presentation, you will be able to tell the difference between them. Usos del imperfecto. So, tiempo. You're going to see the imperfect associated with time quite a bit, but don't naturally assume that because if it's time, that means that it's the imperfect. Time is very much associated to it, but context is the most important thing, and we're going to see why. So, stay with me. Eran las 5 de la tarde. In this example here, we're saying that it was 5 p.m. There are two things that apply here. One of them could be, well, this is a description of the time in that moment, right? Another one is, this is not a specific thing that happened. It's just 5 p.m. could be 5:01, 5:30. It's not telling me specifically. It's just saying it was 5 in the afternoon. So that's one. Acciones habituales. Here we have another one. Cada domingo yo iba a ver a mi abuela. So here we have kind of a clue that it's not a specific thing, but more like a habitual thing that happened every Sunday, right? Cada domingo, every Sunday, which by the way, this is kind of another trigger for the imperfect. Yo iba a ver a mi abuela. In this sentence, it doesn't tell me what specific Sunday or when it started happening. It's just saying every Sunday. So there's ambiguity there. Again, the imperfect. Emociones. Me sentía muy contenta de verla. estados mentales. So for emotions and mental states, we use the imperfect. And again, this would apply to what I have said is kind of like background, right? Descriptions. So in that sense, we use the imperfect. Age, edad. Elena tenía 20 años cuando asistía a la universidad. Acciones progresivas. Now with this one, you may be able to identify that I have two verbs right here, estar and enseñar, but estar right here is conjugated in the imperfect and enseñando is the progressive tense, right? So this is kind of like a different construction. Don't worry too much about it. I'm just pointing it out so you can see it and identify it. But the point is that this is still the imperfect. It was happening in the past. Los maestros estaban enseñando español. So this was happening in the past. And then cuando yo llegué. So an action interrupts this, right? A preterite, because it's an event that happens like once. Clima. Esa noche hacía frío y nevaba. So with this, with the climate, right, or with the con el tiempo, in this case, again, descriptions. This is painting a picture, which is one of the imperfect uses. But if you want to think about it, the rule of thumb is the preterite is going to talk about what you did. The imperfect is what you were doing or what you used to do. So that's pretty much a very specific rule of thumb, something that you can pretty much guide yourself by. So comparisons here, and I'm going to go point by point here with examples. So on the left, we have the preterite. On the right, we have el imperfecto. So I did say that for the preterite, one of those uses was beginning or end, right, of an action. And for the imperfect, it was the habitual nature of an action. So we have two different scenarios. El viernes pasado, la obra de teatro comenzó a las 6 en punto. Last Friday, the play started at 6 o'clock. Terminó a las 8. El dramaturgo habló al final de la obra. So the play started at 6. There's the beginning, right? Terminó a las 8. There's the end. El dramaturgo habló al final de la obra. The playwright spoke at the end of the play. La audiencia aplaudió fuertemente. So the audience clapped resoundingly. So in here, I have a story of something that happened on a specific time frame, on a finite time frame. El viernes pasado. This is an event. Therefore, it's the preterite. All of these have the beginning of a past action and the end of it as well, and just like the events that happened. On the other hand, here on the right, I have todos los viernes, all the Fridays. It doesn't tell me when this started, what Friday, or for, you know, if it was all the Fridays of this month, etc. It just says todos los viernes había una obra de teatro que comenzaba a las 6. So all I know is that this used to happen every Friday, where there was a play that would start at 6. So again, imperfect. It's in the past, but it is an indefinite past. Muchas personas asistían cada semana y aplaudían al final. So many people would go every week and they would clap at the end. So these both things don't cancel each other. This could be just last Friday. Maybe this was the last time that this play, you know, happened. Maybe that's why the playwright spoke at the end of the play, and versus with the imperfect, this was how it used to be before that. There is no specific, right, time. The point is that it's a habitual action, right, that was ongoing. So it's repeated during a period of time. So when you are looking at these examples, or when you're trying to decide which one you're going to use, preterite or imperfect, try to focus on the action where it has a beginning or an ending, whether it's a finite event or if it's a repetitive thing that would happen. So continuing with completed or ongoing. We have been very repetitive about the fact that with the preterite, it's completed, right? Happened once. you also use it for a series of events or a sequence of completed actions. We have this story here with Ana y Luisa. So, primero, first, Ana y Luisa cenaron. First, they had dinner en un café. Luego, after, fueron al cine. So those two things, those two words that are key for me if I was trying to decide what tense I would conjugate these two verbs in would be this one right here, primero. That tells me first. And then I look at this one, luego, right? So then I would say, okay, well, this is probably the preterite because I'm looking at the beginning and then another point in a sequence of events. However, there is another use for the preterite here because we can use it to describe two or more things that were happening at the same time. So concurrent actions, right? The preterite wouldn't work because they're just one-time things while the imperfect are ongoing. So for these, we use the word mientras right here. So I have two examples here to show you. For the preterite, we have Julio leyó hasta que Carlos se durmió. But with the imperfect, Juan leía mientras Carlos dormía. So both of these are in the past. And let's see here. Let me see if I can draw this. So here we have the past, right? Juan leía. So Juan was reading and then Carlos was sleeping, right? Both are happening with mientras, which is what's happening right here. While in this one, we have one event that happened, Julio leyó, hasta que Carlos durmió, and then another. Or if you want to think about it, it would be like this. Two events that happened, concluded, and that's it. Nothing else. So we have another one here. Patricia miraba el desfile. This is a typo. This should be an F. Mientras yo decoraba la mesa. So Patricia was looking at the parade while I was decorating the table. Two things are happening at the same time. They can still be in the past, right? In the imperfect. They're happening at the same time. With mientras, right? All of these have mientras. Mientras mi novio lavaba los platos, hablaba con su mejor amigo. So if you had this and these were blank, right? When you see mientras, then you know, okay, well, this is probably the imperfect, right? While my boyfriend was washing the dishes, he was also talking to his best friend. Okay, so now we have a few more. Background details. Now I really want to hone in on this one because it's going to apply for the next thing that we see, and which is another big one with regards to both of these tenses, which is storytelling. Because once more, storytelling would be an important thing because of past, right? Okay, so use the imperfect to give background details. We are going to give you some examples now. So, era un día hermoso. Hacía mucho sol y los pájaros cantaban. So, for the imperfect, we use it to paint a picture, to describe how things were, to, set the tone, do the setting, right? It was a beautiful day. It was very sunny and the birds were singing. The trees were green. Los árboles ya estaban verdes y no hacía calor and it was not hot. All of this is the imperfect. All of this is painting a picture for you and it's describing a scene and a setting. And now we have something happening here. Durante el Mundial Femenino, and here's a keyword, during, right? So it's setting a time frame. And remember, with the preterite, finite times, okay? So specific. Durante el Mundial Femenino, los fans gritaron, cantaron, y lloraron. I have three verbs right here, all in the preterite. This is very specific to when this happened. It was during the Women's World Cup, right? As opposed to this one. This could also be in the same day, right? In the same event, describing these players during this Women's World Cup. Las jugadoras eran jóvenes, valientes, y todos esperaban ganar. So the players were young, brave, and everybody wanted or hoped to win. You can use that either way. So in this sense, we can use both of these tenses even in the same paragraph together, and there is no conflict between them because they have both different functions. So let's look at comparisons between these two. I'm going to give you a series of examples. These are the ones that we have already covered, but they are going to be more specific. So let's see first. Estuve en la oficina a las 2. So I was in the office at 2. First of all, I have a very specific time here. So remember how I said at the beginning that don't assume that because it's time, it's going to be the imperfect. That's the perfect example here, because I could also be using a time of day to talk about something that happened in that moment, right? So for example, here, I was in the office at 2 o'clock, right? So this event happened with this time frame, and so I use the preterite. Contrast that with estaba en la oficina a las 2 todos los días, every day. So here I have the ambiguity, right? That it was every day, and therefore, because it's ongoing, it is the imperfect. Remember, this is past tense. We're not talking about present tense or any of that. We're talking about the past. Mi abuela se enfermó el verano pasado. So this is an event that happened last summer. She got sick. This is a one-time thing. However, mi abuela se enfermaba todos los inviernos is kind of like a habitual thing, a pattern, if you will, right? My grandma would get sick every winter. So again, it doesn't tell me which winter or anything, it just would happen. Conocí a tu hermana ayer. This is an event that happened. It's a one-time thing. I met your sister yesterday versus no conocía a tu hermana antes. I didn't know your sister before. In this imagined past, we don't know when it happened. We just know that until this point, until whenever, this person had not met, right, their sister. So again, the imperfect. Anoche llovió fuerte. Last night, it rained like heavily. So this happened. But anoche llovía mientras caminaba a casa. So what is the difference here? Because both of them happened last night. Well, this one right here, en el imperfecto, is a description and, mientras, right? So two things are happening concurrently. Last night it was raining while I was walking home. Also, like I said, it's a description. Cuando era niño, jugaba uno, right? Both of these are imperfect verbs because when I was a child, how it used to be. But ayer jugué uno con mi amigo is something that happened yesterday. It was a one-time event. Cuando yo tenía 12 años, and this goes back to something that we have already mentioned, which is age, right? But el día que cumplí 12 años, right? Here I have a specific time frame of something that happened on the day that I turned 12 or whichever I'm referencing that specific day, okay? So this is not a complete thought or anything. I'm just comparing the two. Okay, so let's see other uses for the two together. So this is actually kind of like my favorite way of using it because this is when an action interrupts another action. Una acción interrumpe otra acción. So I want you to take a minute to look at these examples. We have a few here. So you can think of this as something that happens, right? So I'm going to draw another squiggly line here. Let's see. So we have one squiggly line here. And nosotros, we, right? We're going to draw that here. We were eating dinner. They were right here. Just imagine they're eating dinner. Cuando Ana llegó. An event happened right here. Interrupted that flow. Ana arrived. So this would be the imperfect tense, right? Because it was happening until the preterite came and interrupted it. So that's when I'm going to be using them together to tell what was happening when something else interrupted it or another action took place. Here's another example. Mientras veíamos los fuegos artificiales, while we were watching, and here we have mientras, right? Mientras veíamos, while we were watching the fireworks, empezó a llover. So the same thing that happens here. They were watching the fireworks and then, bam, it started raining. So this event interrupts the action, and so it has to be in the preterite because empezó is the beginning, right, of an action. And so therefore, it would be in the preterite. Okay, to tell a story. Let me clear all of this. Telling a story is also how we use these two tenses together. So let's start with remembering that we definitely need to use the imperfect to give those descriptions, to paint a picture. So it sets the scene, describes the conditions that cause the action, or gives these background information. Like, por ejemplo, era una noche fría de invierno, right? So remember that ser is the imperfect, irregular, right? So it's era. Yo estaba en casa con mi perrito. So here is the translation for this, so you can reference it, okay? This gives me the time, date, place, and or characters. All of this would be in the imperfect tense. It could also be, eran las 10 de la noche. It was 10 p.m., right? Estábamos en Madrid. We were in Madrid. All of that would be the imperfect tense, right? Perrito right here, the little dog. The customary, habitual, or routine action. This is one of the uses of the preterite that we saw in the first slides. Normalmente, mi perro, Fifi, pasaba la noche en su camita. So this was the routine action of the little dog, right? He's usually spent the evening in his little bed. Also, it will also tell you, the imperfect, what was going on in that particular moment, right? Pero esa noche parecía un poco nervioso y se escondía detrás del sofá. All of this is adding to the picture, right? Here is the translation for that. He seemed a little nervous, right? Okay, next, we have to move the story forward. And of course, we're going to use the preterite because, again, sequence of actions. And so this moves the story. De repente, this is a keyword right here because this was like ongoing, and suddenly something happens, interrupts everything. De repente, Fifi corrió a la puerta. So of course, I'm going to use the preterite here, right? This action happens. This is an event. Yo lo seguí y abrí la puerta. I followed him and opened the door, right? So then you use these things that happen or these preterite verbs to advance the story. And then you can still go back to the imperfect to add more details and to describe more things that happened, right? Like, por ejemplo, la luna brillaba como el sol, pero no se veía a nadie. You can also add, maybe if you're trying to add some horror element, or maybe if you're trying to make it a scary story or suspense, that's when you use the imperfect to do all of that stuff, right? Like, it was an eerie night. You could hear a pin drop. You would use that in the imperfect. And then you would go back to the preterite to keep moving forward, right? The actions that happen. Cerré la puerta y volví al sofá. Close the door and I returned to the sofa. And so then you can just finally you have to conclude the action because the story ends, right? Fue una noche muy extraña. In this case, it's summing up the experience, right? Using the preterite, you don't have to. You can conclude it a different way, but of course it would be the preterite because it concludes the action. So then that is how you would tell a story, and that is how you would identify in a story which one is the preterite and which one is the imperfect. You're going to look at which one is giving you background information, descriptions, painting a picture, and which one is series of events and moving forward. And also try to make sense of it in the sense of, I don't know, if I threw up, is that something that goes on and on and on, or is that something that happens once? You know, that kind of thing. Triggers for the preterite. Now, always think of context with this. Don't assume naturally that it's always the preterite, because, for example, we can say el otro día, right? And we could be using the imperfect because I'm describing the day, right? But also la semana pasada, el mes pasado could be an entire month, right? But it could also just be specifically the preterite because I'm describing something that happened in a particular moment that ended, right? So again, context. But I would follow this advice. Pay attention to words or phrases that indicate specific timeframes. Always think of finite timeframes that signal the use of the preterite, and of course, beginning or end of an action. Verbs used to discuss events that have like certain beginning or ends, or certain like just a one-time thing that happens, then definitely that's going to be the preterite. For example, casarse, to get married, right? You don't go get married for an extended period of time. You just do it. It's an event. It's a one-time thing. It happens. It's done. Llegar, to arrive. Morir, you don't die for like 5 times. It's just you die once. You are born once, right? Same thing. These are things that are either one or the other. Llegar, morir, nacer, salir, cumplir años, graduarse. These are also events. So all of these you can associate with the preterite. So think of those if you are unsure of which tense to use. Una vez, one time, of course, that would give you a preterite. El otro día, ayer. So these are associated with time. And again, always context. Imperfect triggers. To me, in my opinion, these are more straightforward. These are definitely associated with the imperfect, but always, always pay attention to the context. A menudo, often, frecuentemente, a veces, siempre, algunas veces, mientras, todos los años, todos los días. So notice that we're saying all of them, right? It's not a specific one. Muchas veces, many times, todo el tiempo, casi nunca, de vez en cuando, durante. All of these are vague time frames or repeated events, things that happen repeatedly or not often enough, but none of them delineate a specific event, okay? So, of course, these are going to be the imperfect. Let's move on. Ahora vamos a practicar. I suggest that you pause this video and try to figure out on your own which of the tenses you're going to use. In this paragraph, en este párrafo, both of the preterite and imperfect are going to be used, which is what you're actually going to be seeing in the exam. And moving forward, you're not going to be choosing one or the other. It's going to be both, which is why I have been using back and forth, back and forth. So put it on pause, answer it on your own, and think of all of the stuff that we've been discussing or that I have been discussing, and then come back and see the answers as I go through them. Okay. Ready? Let's go. Anoche, last night, yo, let's leave that there for now. Let's look at the keywords. A la biblioteca, library, con mi compañera de cuarto. So it would be last night and the library with my roommate. It would be I went, right? This is a one-time event. So fui, I went, preterite. Mientras, keyword, we did say that mientras would be ongoing, so I'm going to immediately think that this is going to be the imperfect. Let's continue though, because you need to read the whole sentence before you make a decision. Mientras nosotros, un amigo a la biblioteca. So now I have another, right? Let me see, a friend entered, right? So this would be the preterite, so definitely mientras was the imperfect, because while we were studying, the action was interrupted, right? Un amigo entró a la biblioteca. And that would be the preterite because it's one thing that happened. It's not an ongoing thing. Nosotros, por una hora, 1 hour. Okay, it's specifying a finite amount of time. Then it's the preterite. Correct. We spoke for an hour. Y después, again, another keyword for the preterite, afterwards, right? Series of events. So I'm going to say that's the preterite. Yes, salimos, we left. And salir was one of those verbs, right? With the preterite. De la biblioteca. Now, time. We remember that with the imperfect, we use it for describing the time, right? So I'm going to go with the imperfect here. Eran, yes. Las 9:30, cuando. Cuando is telling me, right, when something happened. Preterite then. Llegamos a la parada. And of course, arriving to the bus stop would definitely be the preterite. So, el autobús, tomar would be the unconjugated verb, right? So to take the bus, and dejar, right? The infinitive, to leave in front of our dorm, de nuestro dormitorio. So then these are both preterites because they're both concluding actions, or also you can see it as a series of actions. We took the bus and the bus left us in front of our dorm. So take a second to look at that and let's move on. Now, en este párrafo, in this paragraph, I'm not really going to translate it for you because it's using the vocabulary, el vocabulario del capítulo for the chapter. I will be translating or interpreting some of the words here and there to give you some context, okay? Es un caso de appendicitis, right? This is a cognate because it's spelled the same way and it means the same thing in both languages. So let's see here. Completa el diálogo entre los dos amigos. Pon atención al uso del pretérito o el imperfecto. Ok. Lorenzo y Ronaldo, dos amigos, están hablando, are talking, del viaje de Rolando a Venezuela. So, Lorenzo's asking Rolando, ¿qué fue lo más divertido de tu año en Venezuela? Remember, ser in the preterite is irregular. So we have a conversation about appendicitis, right? Completa el diálogo entre los dos amigos. Pon atención al uso del pretérito o imperfecto. So both of these. Ronaldo, no lo vas a creer. You won't believe it. Pero fue un ataque de apendicitis. So tener, right? To have. Cuando, estar allí. In this case, an appendicitis attack, un ataque de apendicitis, would be an event, right? So, el pretérito. And tener would be an irregular tense, right? In the yo. Remember, you have to be familiar with how to conjugate this. Tuve. Cuando. Now, would this be the preterite or the imperfect? Let's see. Estar allí. Here, I'm not getting a specific time reference for how long or when this happened. It's just saying when I was there. So therefore, it would be the imperfect. Because it was in the past, we know that it happened at some point in that year, tu año en Venezuela, but it's not telling me specifically when. So therefore, it will be in the imperfect. Cuando estaba allí. Lorenzo asks, ¿qué te pasó? What happened? Once more, pretérito, right? Happened. Ronaldo dice, pues cuando, this is a reflexive, right? Construction. Levantar is the infinitive and me is attached, right? Cuando me levanté. In this case, remember, because this is the preterite, we separate these two. El acento es muy importante. You cannot do without the accent in the preterite because if you don't put it, it may mean something else, a different tense, and therefore it would not be the preterite anymore, even if you conjugated it correctly. Pues cuando me levanté un lunes. Now, would this be the preterite or the imperfect? Sentirme. Remember, all of these are reflexive. Why? Because this is the action reflecting on yourself. And this is something that is important because we're going to talk about reciprocals in a moment. Remember, these are related. Right? Reflexives are actions that follow myself. Me, myself, right? Cuando me levanté un lunes, sentirme. So preterite or imperfect. This is a description, right? Remember that it's emotional states, physical states is also included here. So, me sentía mal. And also, el acento no es opcional. It would be pronounced differently if it didn't have it. So, please be very mindful of accents. Pero no querer perder el tiempo en un consultorio médico. So, here, I'm going to help you with this one. It's the preterite, okay? Because this happened once. No quise perder el tiempo. I didn't want to waste time. Por la tarde, in the afternoon, we have to pay attention to these references to time. La temperatura se puso muy alta, right? The temperature was very high. Once more, this would be the preterite, right? This is signaling. Temperature went up. Y me doler, right? Now, this is going to be the imperfect because we don't know, first of all, how long did his stomach hurt? Me dolía el estómago, right? But more than that, we also have to think about the fact that this is a description of his physical state, okay? So, esa noche, now I have a specific reference to time once more, so pretérito. Esa noche dormí muy mal. So it's telling me this night, and then, of course, before I get ahead of myself and conjugate that, I always need to look at the rest of the sentence to understand the context. The next thing says, la mañana siguiente, the next morning. So now I know that the first clause, esa noche, muy mal, right? That is going to be that time because the next clause is the next morning. So then, pretérito, dormí, and then la mañana siguiente, empezar is also pretérito because it's the beginning of an action. Empecé a vomitar. And remember, recuerda the spelling changes, right? Z to C en el pretérito and only in some. So, por favor, repasa esto. Lorenzo asks, pregunta, ¿por qué no llamaste a tus amigos? Preterite because it's one action. Ronaldo dice, no los imperfecto conocía because todavía, right? I hadn't met them yet. Once more, ambiguity, not a specific event, just something that we don't know when he met them, right? Pero sí llamé a una ambulancia. So this one, of course, is going to be in the preterite as well because I called an ambulance. Me llevaron al hospital. They took me. Sequence of events. And also, of course, it's just a thing that happens. Pero no veo lo cómico de todo eso. I don't see what's so funny. Espera. Por fin me operaron. Finally, they did surgery on me. Notice again the use of the preterite here with operar. Finally, they operated on me. And so once more, I have cuando, right? Keyword for pretérito. Cuando me desperté de la operación, when I woke up, repetía constantemente. Why is this in the imperfect? Because he repeated, repetía, right? Constantemente en español. no puedo hablar en español. I can't speak in Spanish. Por lo visto, lo único que me preocupaba era hablar el español, pues no lo hablaba bien en aquel entonces. So these uses, all of these are the imperfect because, once more, en aquel entonces, back then. Las enfermeras y el doctor Castillo se rieron mucho. This is the last sentence, ends the story, preterite, of course, but once more, also just an event that happened. Now let's change gears, cambiemos de tema a los pronombres relativos, que, quiénes y lo que. So los pronombres relativos have different uses, but mainly you can just think of them as used to add more information about a noun in a sentence. And this applies specifically to que. We're going to see why. And they also just connect ideas within a sentence. They basically take small sentences and make one complex sentence, right? So that way they can also just reduce redundancy. We have an example here. Juan tiene dos perros. That's one sentence, right? Juan has two dogs. Aquí está la traducción. Los perros de Juan son negros. So, una oración, otra oración. Now, if I combine them together con que, Juan tiene dos perros que son negros. In this case, que would translate into that, right? Here we have information about this noun, which are los dos perros, the two dogs, right? It's telling us son negros. So here we have a very handy guide, right? Que is going to refer to things or people. Quienes only refers to people, and of course, quien versus quienes is going to depend on plural or singular, and lo que to a situation. Okay, let's start with this one. So it can have different meanings. I know that can be confusing, but it doesn't have to be, because we're going to give you very definite examples, and you're not going to have any issues with it if you follow these rules. So it could be that, it could be which, or it could be who. It can refer to people or to things, but always focus on these two uses. You can use it to give more information, to define and to describe, and to link sentences together. And this one is the one that is used most of all of the three that we're studying, okay? Aquí hay un ejemplo. Veo una casa blanca, parentheses, just giving you that information. It is a White House. En una oración, putting it all together with que, I would just add that in there. Veo una casa que es blanca. So in this case, this second example right here, el niño que visitó a doña Mercedes es el sobrino de la vecina, right? So, ¿cuál es el uso? What is the use here? We are expanding information by defining and describing. El niño is the noun, right? And so here in this part, I am definitely describing this boy, este niño, right? And giving more information about him, just as I did in this sentence above. So with que, right, I have the who in this example, in this context, right? The boy who visited Doña Mercedes is the neighbor's nephew. So, como dije, as I said, is para conectar dos oraciones, to connect two sentences. So we have two sentences right here. Mi madre compró un carro, right? My mother purchased a car. El carro costó mucho dinero. The car cost a lot of money. It's a little redundant, right? Like I'm saying un carro here, and I'm saying el carro here. So I probably in real life don't want to say this twice. Instead, I can just link these two with a que. Mi madre compró un carro que costó mucho dinero. That's it. Más sencillo y evita la redundancia. ¿Quiénes or quién? Who or whom? Very, very easy to tell the difference between quién and quiénes, because quiénes and quién only refers to people. Solo se refiere a personas. And it is only used after a preposition. Estas son las preposiciones. Some examples here. There's several more, but I will give you examples with several of these before we end this video. Or you could also identify them when a clause is set off by a comma. Now remember that a clause would contain an entire idea, right? Por ejemplo, mi hermana, quien vive en Venezuela, nació en Bolivia. En este caso, in this case, I don't have a preposition, pero tengo una cláusula. I have a clause, right? That's set off by this comma. We have three, right? Mi hermana here, quien vive en Venezuela. However, you could use que or quien in these situations, so you're not going to be in trouble because when in doubt, use que. But you always know that you only use this after a preposition. And so therefore, if you saw a preposition, por ejemplo, Olivia y Rosa son las compañeras con quienes estudio español. I see this preposition, right? I wouldn't put a que here. I would use quienes because with a que, it would not be correct. So that's a very firm reason to use one or the other. To recap, you could use quien if there is a clause set off by a comma, but you can also use que when in doubt. However, quien or quienes is only used after a preposition. And those are a, de, con, por, para, etc. So, Olivia y Rosa son las compañeras con quienes, because Olivia y Rosa are two, estudio español. Lo que. Now, lo que refers to an entire concept, to an idea, to something that is previously unknown in a sentence. So if you are trying to identify it, think about the fact that it is not going to be talking about a particular noun as opposed to que, because remember that que is used to define and describe a particular noun. Lo que is going to be talking about a broad idea. So it translates into the thing that, or that which, or what. None of these are actual specific nouns, right? It refers to a whole idea, situation, or a concept. So it frequently starts sentences, so that could be a kind of clue for you. Don't just assume, though, that all the time, but it's kind of like something to guide you. And, por ejemplo, we have, ¿sabes lo que dijo Panchita? So here we have an example of something that isn't specific, right? Do you know what Panchita says? We do not know. And lo que is just referring to something that is that is being referred to that is absolutely not specific at all. And so therefore, lo que is used. Okay, so no entiendo lo que dijo. I don't understand that which he said. Once more, this is nothing specific that is being referred to, saying I don't understand what was said. Lo que is never used to ask a direct question. Here is another example. Lo que me preocupa es que tengo un examen mañana. This thing that I'm worried about is not specific. It's not referring to anyone in particular in any of these examples. So once more, you can determine that you would not be using que or quienes in any of these cases anyway, because it doesn't apply. Ahora, vamos a practicar. The strategy, la estrategia es identificar el antecedente. Identify the antecedent. ¿Qué es el antecedente? What is being referred to or who is being referred to in the sentence before this relative pronoun, okay? Por ejemplo, este es el carro. This is the car. This is a particular noun, right? Queremos comprar el nuevo Honda Civic. It's talking about something and it's describing it and kind of defining it. Que would be. And also, no es quienes. It is not quien or quienes because it's not people, right? And it's also not lo que because, once more, it's not a particular idea. It's actually a specific noun. Correcto. So when it says here, lo que, the antecedent is often unknown or not mentioned, you wouldn't find it here, right? That's another clue. Los estudiantes. So puede ser, ¿quiénes? Well, it does not have a preposition, so therefore it has to be que. Las personas con. Is this a preposition? Sí, sí es una preposición. And so, ¿quiénes? Because las personas is more than one. Las personas con quienes salgo son muy divertidas. La amiga de es una preposición. Yes, it is a preposition. ¿Quién? This is beginning of a sentence. It's el principio de una oración. So that is going to tell me that it is likely going to be this. And it also is a whole concept. Lo que más me asusta de las películas de terror es la música. This whole clause right here, what scares me the most about horror movies is the music, right? It's a whole concept. Ahora es un ejemplo más largo. It's a longer example. Ellos son los chicos de. Now we have a preposition. ¿Quiénes? Perfecto. El chico lleva la camisa roja. El chico, the boy, lleva, is telling me what he's wearing. Entonces debe ser que. Correcto. Also did not have a preposition. El chico que lleva la camisa roja se llama Juan Pablo. Y el muchacho bajito, the short guy, con preposition. ¿Quién would be the correct answer? Con quién está hablando se llama Mauricio. 7. Este es el restaurante. This is the restaurant. Definitivamente it has to be que because, again, specific noun and it's not a person. Este es el restaurante que tanto me gusta. Sirven tacos de coliflor. 8. Esos son los pacientes de, we have a preposition, ¿quiénes? Te hablaba. Once more, pacientes is plural. Según el médico, we have a comma, right? But we are talking about an idea here. So then we would use lo que, because we have to pay attention to this here. We do not know what he has, right? Su padre es normal, so it would be ambiguous in this case. So this antecedent is unknown or not mentioned in this case. So therefore, the answer is lo que. Según el médico, lo que tiene su padre es normal. According to the doctor, that which his father has is normal. This one begins the sentence, so it's probably lo que. And once more, it's talking about something that happens, a situation, right? Lo que is correcto. Mi madre, I have a comma here, right? Es artista. So it's describing this person, trabaja en un museo. Could it be quién? Or could it be que? Well, it could be either because it's being set off by this comma, right? So either one is fine, either one is correct. ¿Quién or qué? Las acciones recíprocas or reciprocal actions are the actions that involve two or more people doing things to each other. So, for example, pelearse, to fight. Darse la mano, to shake hands, or saludarse, besarse. All of these verbs that express acts that are reciprocal by nature. Now, these verbs or these verbal constructions use reflexive pronouns. We have studied reflexive pronouns and reflexive verbs before, but I will go over them briefly, especially because reciprocal constructions follow the same rules. And so they're very similar and we can use them as a basis to start off with. I suggest studying this in more depth if you don't remember it or if you need to refresh in your memory. It will actually make this a lot easier. It's not very complicated at all. Reciprocal verbs are verbs that reflect the action on the subject. You can think of them as walking to a mirror and seeing your reflection on it, right? So the reflection, reflexive, kind of that word association will help you remember this. You can identify these because of the conjugations here, like the endings of the infinitives, right? They always end in SE, bañarse, dormirse, acostarse. Reciprocal verbs also have the same endings, okay? So you can identify them as such. But with reflexive constructions, these are the acts that have one subject, right? So for example, bañarse. Yo me baño. Tú te bañas. Él se baña. All of these have one subject. For example, because when you are bathing, you are performing this act on yourself. When he's bathing, he's doing it to himself, etc., etc., etc. Dormirse, to sleep, fall asleep, go to sleep, all of them, same. The action is on yourself, on your body, on their body, whichever the subject is in the sentence, right? Levantarse, to get up, acostarse, to lay down, afeitarse, to shave, all of the verbs that express things that you do to take care of yourself. Even, for example, peinarse, maquillarse, to put makeup on. Any of these things that you do on yourself would be a reflexive construction or reflexive verb. With reciprocal ones, however, we have an action that is done to two people. So, for example, Julia y su abuela se abrazan, right? They hug each other. Or nosotras nos abrazamos. So there are verbs that are not necessarily reflexives, but if you attach the pronouns to them, then the meaning will change. The same goes for reciprocal. Now, let's look at, for example, the verb besar. You could say, yo beso a mi mamá, right? I kiss my mom, and say that you kissed your mom on her head, on her cheek, versus yo y mi novia, or nosotros nos besamos, right? Like you kiss each other. So let's see this illustrated. Mateo besa a su hijo. In this case, Mateo is performing the action on his son. There is not a reciprocal action being performed. But in this example, there is a reciprocal action of ellos se besan, right? Both parties are performing the action on each other. So to recap, reflexive actions indicate that the action is done to oneself, whereas reciprocal actions indicate that the action is done to each other. And both of them use reflexive pronouns. But not all reflexive pronouns. It would only be the plural pronouns, because again, it has to be two or more people. So what are these constructions? It would be ustedes, ellos, ellas, nosotros, nosotras, which are the plural subjects, right? These are the reflexive pronouns. It's only these two because if you recall, with reflexive pronouns, se and se reflect the third person singular and plural. So once more, it's a little simpler because of that. Entonces, nos and the conjugated verb. Nos abrazamos, right? For nosotros, nosotras, whichever one it is. And then, of course, we are going to conjugate this verb according to the tense that we're using, right? Also for se. For what we use se in, which would be third person, ustedes, ellos, ellas. Por ejemplo, ustedes se besan, ellos se besan, ellas se besan. Or if we want to change the tense, the time, ellos se besaron, ellas se besaban. So this would be the preterite, el pretérito, y el imperfecto, the imperfect, right? So that conjugation according to whichever tense, of course, but we are going to put this pronoun in front of the verb unless there are a few exceptions and you put the pronoun attached to the verb. But I will explain it when we see a couple of examples in a little bit. Let's look at some here. Cuando visito a mi mamá, siempre nos abrazamos. So the same example as above, but contextualized in a sentence. When I visit my mom, siempre, always, nos abrazamos, present tense. Los amigos que se quieren se abrazan cuando se saludan, right? So once more, with friends, here is not being specified if it's two friends or many friends. It's just making a general statement about friends that care about each other. So as you can see, all of these have that reflexive pronoun in front and the conjugated verb. El año pasado, nosotros nos vimos en un concierto. So here we have nos vimos, and here we're using the preterite, right? An event happened last year in a concert. We saw each other. Same thing, nothing changes. We are just using these reciprocal constructions to demonstrate that an act happened that was done to each other. Ellos se besaron cuando se saludaron. Again, two verbs, the same construction. So action done to each other or to one another, if that's how you want to think of it. We have some examples here, okay? So we have the examples in English here. So I'm not gonna really read over them, and we are going to go over the Spanish ones. Vamos a repasar los ejemplos en español. Nosotros nos abrazábamos todos los días. So abrazábamos is in the imperfect, and so we have to follow the rules according to these. Nosotros would have an accent in these cases, and so that is according to the rule, right, of the verb, but in essence, it's still the same construction. Ellos se ven todos los lunes. Ustedes se respetan. Now, if you look at these two, we have two pronouns, right? Ellos se ven, and then ustedes se respetan. So depending on context, it may or may not be optional. If it's unclear who they're talking about, then sure, you can use those pronouns. If not, it's optional. Tomás y Patricio se quieren. Nos dimos la mano después de pelearnos. Now, you may notice here that this example right here, pelearnos, después de, actually has this pronoun attached to the verb. Now, this happens in three different cases. You would attach the pronoun, the reflexive pronoun, to the verb in the case of después de, because in this case, después de works as a preposition in Spanish. And with this example, you have an infinitive, usually after después de. And so it would be, if it wasn't a reflexive verb, right? In this case, it would be después de pelear, Juan trabajó, for example, right? But because it's a nos use, like nosotros, then we attach this nos to the infinitive. And so one of those three exceptions in Spanish for when you attach that pronoun to an infinitive is this one, okay? So just keep that in mind. If you ever wondered about it, we're going to see this more with imperatives or commands, which is going to be in the next chapter. I will talk about it again. That is the other exception for when you attach a pronoun to a verb. But this is just so you can keep it in mind and it won't confuse you if you are wondering why. But for now, just see it as después de, then I can attach it to the verb. Okay. Los amigos se dieron regalos para Navidad. Once more, se dieron, right? Pronoun, verb, conjugated. Nos besamos ayer. Karen y Kevin no se llaman. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes to look at this. You can also pause it. Make sure that you understand all of these. If you have any questions, you can always send me a message. We can also use many of these. Let me actually explain the concept of a verb that can work reflexively or non-reflexively. So you will notice that I have written some of these verbs as just besar, abrazar, or darse la mano, quererse, saludarse, llamar, pelearse, o dar. For example, I could use all of these reflexively, right? But without the se, there are different meanings. So let's use this one, llamar. You could say, for example, nos llamamos todos los días. We call each other every day, right? Or ellos se llaman. So in this case, we're using it reciprocally, right? However, you could also say, yo llamo a mi perro. I call my dog, right? In this case, you're using it as llamar. Now, how about dar? This is something that works as a one-way or two-way street. For example, you could say, le doy un regalo a mi madre. I give my mother a gift. Or when you go to the Christmas exchange or the white elephant, you could say, nos damos regalos. So again, many of these verbs are not necessarily reciprocal or reflexive verbs. So that applies to both concepts. So always think about, is this action reciprocal, right? Or is it done to myself, if you're wondering if it's reflexive, or is it being given or done to a person? Okay, are they the recipient of it? So that would be the way to tell the difference. So let's practice. Vamos a practicar todo junto. In this case, we bring it all together. We're going to have a few preterites or imperfects. I want you to pay attention to that. And we are going to be doing these conjugations in the reciprocal constructions. So you can pause the video, conjugate the verbs on your own, and then come back, look at the answers, and compare. Al principio de la historia, Romeo y Julieta no se conocían. Ellos se vieron por la primera vez una noche en la casa de Julieta. So in this case, the first conjugation here is in the imperfect because there's an indeterminate past that we don't know. It's in the past, it used to be, and so se conocían. No se conocían, sorry. They did not know each other. Ellos se vieron. This is an event, right? This happened once, por la primera vez, which is kind of like your clue here too, that it's a preterite. Una noche en una fiesta, other clues. Esa noche, después de la fiesta, other clues, right? We have a finite time here. Después de la fiesta, Romeo fue a la casa de Julieta. So of course, this is going to be a preterite once more because of that time frame, time reference. La vio en el balcón de su alcoba. He saw her in the balcony. And if you are familiar with Romeo and Juliet, you will be familiar with the context here. Y los jóvenes se hablaron por varias horas. So in this case, they are talking to each other, of course. And so this verb is expressing that. Descubrieron que se amaban muchísimo. Why would this be in the imperfect? Well, because once more, this is a description of an emotional state. So this fulfills that use of the imperfect. Pero era un amor imposible, porque las familias Montague y Capulet, sorry about the typo here, se odiaban desde hace siglos. And this imperfect here is explained by two reasons. Once more because of the emotions, right? But also because of this hace siglos. So this was like for centuries, right? So once more, an indeterminate time period. Sin embargo, Romeo y Julieta decidieron casarse. They decided to marry. Una tarde, ellos se encontraron en el monasterio del fraile Lorenzo y él los casó. So casarse, of course, is going to be a reciprocal action because they're marrying each other. But here, casó, el fraile, he married them, right? So this priest is performing an act on these two. So there is a difference here where it's being used reciprocally and when it is not being used that way. So you can see the difference. So the other point here is that these are going to be a series of events that happened on a certain afternoon, una tarde. Therefore, they are all in the preterite. Después de la ceremonia, Los novios se besaron apasionadamente. Once more, the preterite and of course a reciprocal action. Sin embargo, la historia de Romeo y Julieta terminó trágicamente. Of course, we do know that it ended tragically, right? Lo único bueno de ello fue la reconciliación de sus familias. The only good thing was the reconciliation of their families. Mientras lloraban. Notice this, mientras right here, and the imperfect, while they cried, mientras lloraban, el padre de Romeo y el padre de Julieta se abrazaron. Why would this be a preterite? Because they hugged each other. They were not hugging, they hugged each other. So it happened, they hugged. Ellos se dijeron, nuestros hijos se querían mucho. No seamos enemigos más. They told each other. Once more, an event that happened and concluded. Nuestros hijos se querían. This is a description of an emotion, but also it was in the past. They died, right? It wasn't an act that happened once. It's an emotion that is kind of self-explanatory in the sense that it's not an event that happens, but rather it's something that's more ambiguous. Therefore, we use the imperfect. Nuestros hijos se querían. Let's not be friends, or sorry, enemies any longer. So that is a great example of using the preterite and the imperfect and for using reciprocal constructions or reciprocal verbs. Now we have another one here. This will also use the imperfect, the preterite, and reciprocal actions. Now, in this case, we will also have two examples where we attach those pronouns to the verbs, and I will explain it. So also pause here, conjugate these verbs, and come back and look at the answers. So, tres amigos, three friends, Marcos, Beatriz, y Raquel, están chismoseando or chismeando or gossiping about their friends and how they met. Pon atención a los tiempos. Pay attention to the tenses. Beatriz dice, ¿cuándo se conocieron Margarita y Carolina? Marcos dice, creo que el año pasado, en una boda. Raquel, fue cuando Martín y Roberta se casaron. And if we remember, casarse is to get married. Beatriz, sí, ellas se vieron por primera vez en la recepción. They saw each other for the first time at the wedding reception. So the friends are talking about when Margarita and Carolina met, and it was at their friend's wedding. Mi amiga Rosa dice que ellas se miraban toda la noche. So let's pause here and look at the use of the tenses, a los tiempos. We have an event that happened when these two women met. Se conocieron. Therefore, we use the preterite. It was in an event, a wedding, right? We talked about how casarse or to get married is one of the triggers for the preterite, right? Se casaron. So once more, it would be the preterite. Now we have here that they saw each other for the first time. And so this is once more a clue that the preterite is used because once more a finite action, the first time. Primera vez se vieron. But here we have the imperfect. Mi amiga Rosa dice que ellas se miraban toda la noche. Well, here we have a more ambiguous time period, right? It says all night. It doesn't say when, and it's describing something that was ongoing throughout the night. They were looking at each other all night. Therefore, we use the imperfect. De repente, suddenly, trigger for the preterite, right? Something happens, interrupts that action. De repente, Margarita invitó a bailar a Carolina. So Margarita invited Carolina to dance, right? And so invitó would be the preterite, pero estaban tan nerviosas que no se hablaron. So they went and danced, but they were so nervous, they didn't talk to each other. So here we go with this use of the preterite once more. Why would that be? Well, because this is during this dance, but here we have another use of the imperfect. Estaban tan nerviosas. But with here, we have a description of the characters and how they were during this event. So therefore, we use the imperfect. Marcos. Pues ahora, we're switching back to present tense. Cuando las veo, siempre están. And so I want to highlight this. We have a verb here, estar, but it is in the present tense. And we have another verb, hablar, right? So if you recall, or maybe if this hasn't been said to you before, when you have two verbs together, generally the first one is conjugated and the second one is in infinitive, okay? So that is the second reason why you would attach a pronoun to an infinitive. In this case, it would be están hablándose, because this is a reciprocal construction, okay? So if this is a little confusing to you, don't worry too much about it. We are going to talk about it further, and we are actually going to talk about it in more depth in the next chapter when we look at commands, imperativos. But for now, what you need to think about or remember is that there are three cases in which you would attach a pronoun to the verb, right? In these situations, which reflexive and reciprocals is one of them. One of them is when we have an infinitive, right? Two verbs together, it's called the verbal phrase. The first one is conjugated and the second one is an infinitive. And for here, we're going to add the pronoun. And maybe you have seen me add this type of comment in a quiz or an exam or in my feedback when I say, for example, me gusta, and then the next one, you have to leave it in an infinitive when you're talking about your hobbies or things like that. For example, me gusta viajar, me gusta trabajar, because gustar is the first verb. And if the second one is a verb, like your hobby is a verb, the second one is an infinitive, okay? So I hope that makes sense. If not, please send me a message and I will post a longer explanation for this. Okay, so in these both cases, this applies because we have the verb estar, and with this o, it means that the same thing applies, like there is no changes. This is kind of like linking, like working as a comma, right? In this clause, it's still the same thing. It's still the same thought. Siempre están hablándose o abrazándose, okay? So in this case, yes, we are attaching the se at the end of these verbs, okay? You're going to see this a lot more in commands. Tienen una relación bonita porque se respetan mucho y no se pelean casi nunca. So they have a beautiful relationship, or a very nice relationship, because they respect each other and they don't fight often, or almost never, if we're being literal. Raquel, sí, están muy enamoradas. Se quieren mucho. Creo que van a casarse en octubre. So here we also have two verbs, right? Van a casarse, right? You could also say this a different way. You could say, creo que se van a casar. In this case, you would put, let me see if I can write this here. In this case, we could put it, right? The pronoun in front of the verb with the a here, and then the second infinitive. So this is a specific construction because if you recall, ir a is a type of way of talking about the future, right? Voy a trabajar, and you may have seen that before. Voy a estudiar. Remember that the second one is an infinitive, and that's why it would admit this. Okay, muy bien. I hope that this makes sense. And if not, please make sure to post on the open forum or send me a message and I will be happy to explain it to you. And so with anything else in this presentation. Let's look at a few more examples. En España, cuando los amigos se despiden, generalmente se dan la mano. In this example, I left these verbs in infinitive because I would like to remind you that just because they are in infinitives doesn't mean that they can't work as reciprocals, right? So always pay attention to the context and what's going on. You are not going to have to worry too much about this. If you see the despedirse, you can always pay attention. But in that case, remember, it could be reciprocal or it could be reflexive, right? So pay attention to the context and everything. With the exam, you will be asked to write using reciprocal constructions, which is why I'm emphasizing this so much. So pay attention to it and remember how to express it. We are only using it in nos and se. Otherwise, we do not use it with reciprocals. Muchos padres e hijos se hablan por teléfono cuando viven lejos. Las relaciones siempre son mejores entre los jefes y los empleados cuando ellos se respetan. So let's go over these quickly. In Spain, en España, cuando los amigos se despiden, and we remember that despedirse is to say goodbye. Generalmente, this is easy to understand, right? Generally, se dan la mano. They shake hands. This is actually one of the verbs and vocabulary that has been introduced in this chapter. All of these phrases and words are. Muchos padres e hijos se hablan. They talk to each other por teléfono cuando viven lejos. Las relaciones, relationships, siempre son mejores, are always better, entre los jefes y los empleados, between bosses and employees, cuando ellos se respetan. And respetar, if you recall, is to respect each other. Traditionally, and this is kind of easy to understand based on the spelling, right? Los novios no se ven. So los novios would mean the bride and groom, or the grooms, or the brides, whichever is getting married, whichever persons. No se ven antes de la ceremonia de boda, for the wedding ceremony, right? This is kind of like an old tradition, not sure how current it is or not. Los buenos amigos que se quieren se abrazan cuando se saludan. So I hope that this review has been very useful for you, and make sure that you pause it and work on these exercises. And if you have any other questions or anything, make sure to send me a message. Hasta luego. Que tengan muy buena suerte.